Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to NCOA webinar, Neuropsychiatric Disability from Carbon Monoxide Poisoning. We have a special guest here, Gordon Johnson, and really excited for him to speak. My name is Sharon McNabb. I'm founder and president of the National Carbon Monoxide Awareness Association. Very thrilled to be here. Next. We are a grassroots nonprofit 501c3 based in Southeast Michigan. Our mission is to drive a comprehensive conversation on the public health crisis of chronic and acute carbon monoxide poisoning. And we believe that carbon monoxide is 100% preventable. And our vision is to end injury and death due to carbon monoxide poisoning. Next. And so I'd like to just introduce Gordon Johnson. He is an attorney at the Brain Injury Law Group that he started in. Gordon, I'm going to let you introduce yourself if you don't mind.
Okay. I'm a brain injury lawyer. And I've been doing nothing but that since 1996. But I came into carbon monoxide poisoning about 2010 because those people who survive a carbon monoxide poisoning and have disability, almost every one of those people is going to have that disability resulting from some sort of damage to the brain or neurological system. So when I started doing carbon monoxide poisoning, it became clear that what I had been doing for the 20 years before that in brain injury applied perfectly. So all I really did was change the nature of the type of cases I was trying to prove, from people who got injured in car wrecks to people who got hurt by carbon monoxide. And carbon monoxide is all I do now, which gives me an opportunity to understand it from many different directions. I understand the medicine because I've been doing the medicine of brain injury since 1996. I'm not a doctor, but I spend more time talking and listening to people with brain damage than most doctors do. There are very few doctors who specialize in brain injury 100%, and there virtually are no doctors who spend 100% of their time doing carbon monoxide poisoning. There are a few who do a lot of it.
So you have to understand the medical portion in order to make your cases.
Absolutely. Cases typically are won or resolved because the defendants, the insurance companies typically will hire a group of doctors who they hire all the time. And if they think that those doctors can persuade a jury that there's nothing wrong with the plaintiff, they're going to try the case, hope to get zero verdicts. So the lawyer's ability to show that the doctor truly doesn't understand the field or is intellectually dishonest in how he's diagnosing or minimizing the injury of the plaintiffs is basically what these cases come down to. Now,
I appreciate that. So I really appreciate you introducing your background, and I want to showcase your book, Carbon Monoxide Poisoning, the lethality. How do you pronounce that, Gordon?
I think don't ask me to do it 3 times, but I think it's the lethality of the missing oxygen atom.
I love this. And Gordon did a book signing at the summit this year in Kansas City. Thank you so much for that, Gordon.
Well, thank you for allowing me the opportunity.
I just love this book. It is a very pragmatic approach to carbon monoxide poisoning. It's not terribly thick, but it has a lot of juicy details in here. What made you decide to write this, Gordon?
Well, partially it was your organization. I had been working on this book for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, and it actually had started on it as a different book about understanding brain damage and frontal lobe deficits and the complexity of brain injury beyond what people think of as strictly a cognitive problem. And then when I got more and more involved in carbon monoxide, I started to write some of the unique aspects of brain damage from carbon monoxide. And then when you invited me to come and be a presenter and an exhibitor and told me that I could distribute copies of something to the people who came, I decided I should get that book together. And so it was very much fun for me because I'd really never had a chance to sign a book before. I've written books, but not very many people have written them. So I've distributed more copies of that book than all the other books I put together. And
Wow.
thank you
Well,
for
it's a great book.
the motivation to get it done.
Yeah, I know you were very quick to get this to press, and we really appreciate it. So anybody who has a copy of the signed book, please excuse the typos because it was very quick to press. But Gordon, in this book, you talk about first understanding CO, then who's at fault for the poisoning, and then diagnosing the disability after the CO poisoning. So you really cover a lot of bases in here. I'm going to just cut to the chase. What are your one or two takeaways? If you wanted everyone on the audience to understand what's in the book, what would it be?
Well, the motivation for the beginning of the book was to help people understand the full breadth of the problems that people have after they have brain damage. But when the book changed its focus to being also about carbon monoxide poisoning, the major motivation for most of that was the problem that people think that carbon monoxide is a binary choice. You either die from it or you have a full recovery. They picture it like you almost drowned, but somebody came in and gave you artificial respiration within 3 minutes and you're fine. You know, there's always that. If you don't have 5 minutes of not breathing, you're not going to have brain damage. Well, carbon monoxide is much different than a near drowning, although it has similar attributes as well, because carbon monoxide leaves a poison behind in your body. It's not just about the oxygen. And I would say 90% of our medical establishment, from the people who respond to the emergencies, to the EMTs, to the ER doctors, and to the family doctors who treat people long-term, they think that if you recovered, you get your oxygen levels back down to normal, that you're not going to have any problem. And the reality is about half of the people who have significant carbon monoxide poisoning are going to have long-term disability from it. And most of that disability is brain injury. Obviously, the most serious carbon monoxide poisoning events, people die, but there's 30 times as many people who survive as die. And that means 15 times as many people who die are going to have permanent brain damage. And permanent brain damage in many ways robs more years of life than death does.
That is a very interesting perspective. So if I can summarize that, it's basically be suspicious. Don't assume that just because someone had CO poisoning that they're going to be okay. 50% with permanent brain damage is significant. Is there a way to distinguish which 50% will have CO poisoning and which won't?
Well, first, the question becomes is, was the person poisoned? Okay, so we're now talking about a group of people who were poisoned, and defining what poisoning is a complicated and probably beyond the debate that we'd want to have in this conversation. But if we start with a group of people who were in fact poisoned, there's really not much predicting as to who's going to have the disability and who's not, except when the poisoning happens more than once. So probably a third to a half of carbon monoxide poisoning cases are not an isolated event. They are what I would call, there's two other terms I would use. One would be a chronic poisoning where the poisoning levels are more modest, not necessarily not serious, more modest, where the carbon dioxide levels in the air do not exceed what we would expect a UL 2034 alarm to go off at. And then we have people who have multiple acute exposures, meaning that the CO in the air was probably above 100 parts per million, and it happened on multiple days. And let's say it happened 10 times or 20 times. But if it happens on multiple days, your probability of disability is going to go up. So because of the nature of being an event that happens in the air, indoor air, in most of our cases, there's more than one person got hurt. And in a lot of those cases, not everybody gets hurt. Again, not everybody gets poisoned, but not everybody has trouble. But in the cases where that poisoning happened 3, 4, 10 times, almost everybody's going to have disability then, because the poisoning overlaps with the recovery from the first poisoning. One of the unique things about carbon monoxide, and it sort of surprised me when I started doing that from brain injury, is in brain injury, there is always the presumption that the worst moment in brain injury is the event itself, and then it's always a straight line of getting better from that point. When I started doing carbon monoxide poisoning, there was a clear recognition in the medical community of something called delayed neurological sequelae, DNS. And for some reason, the medical community was more sensitive to this relapse of symptoms that you see after carbon monoxide than something that is true in brain injury too, but not as predictable. So let's assume for the sake of argument that you have a poisoning and 5 days later you have this reoccurring event, delayed neurologic DNS, meaning you have almost like you've been poisoned again. That's how your body's responding, the symptoms. So if you're having the DNS 5 days later, and then you get poisoned again, you're dealing with an acute poisoning and you're dealing with the symptoms of DNS. And if that happens every 5 days, you may never have completely recovered from the DNS from the first one, but now you're going to be overlapping the DNS from the subsequent events. So the people who get these environmental exposures where there's a bad furnace and no CO detector, and it takes a really horrible day for them to be so symptomatic that they call the EMTs or get the management company out, or somehow or another there's awareness that it's CO, those people are much more likely to have a bad result.
That's very interesting. So multiple exposures increases your risk of long-term brain damage.
I mean, let's think about it like football player and concussion, okay? And if you're a football fan, you know about Tua, because this year he had another one of those severe brain injury responses to mild head injury forces. And clearly there's something about his brain that makes him very, very vulnerable to what would be a fairly routine hit on another quarterback. But if we were going to say who's the most likely to have this serious problem we see in 40 and 50-year-old former football players, the whole thing that started the CTE controversy, it isn't the quarterbacks like Tua who had 3 or 4 documented concussions. It's the linemen and the linebackers and people who were getting hit on every play. It's not the severity of 3 or 4 injuries that necessarily cause this long-term disability. It's accumulation of how much trauma you've had. And if that CO poisoning goes on long enough, it may be more than what you would have on a single event.
Appreciate that. So I'm going to ask participants, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. Gordon, I have a question for you. I heard that you only represent survivors of CO poisoning. Is that true? Not anyone who has passed from poisoning.
We would not, we would certainly accept a case in a death case, but death cases don't get to lawyers who necessarily have expertise in the field, because if someone dies, the personal injury case is usually signed up by a family lawyer or someone in the local community. And we get our cases from nationwide, from people who realize that they need to have someone who's really an expert. And for that, and for reasons that are kind of hard to explain, we've never had the opportunity to represent anyone in a death case. I would be more than happy to handle a death case. And but it's one of those odd things about personal injury. The more severe the person injured, the less the lawyer feels like he has to know to prove the case.
Mm,
So
interesting.
lawyers who would turn down a 10% COHP poisoning case would jump into a case where someone died.
Mm,
They don't know how to prove somebody has disability from a 10% level, but they know they can prove that the person died.
interesting. We have a question from Stephanie Trotter. She runs a nonprofit focused on carbon monoxide safety in the UK. And she says that she's read 20 pages of your book and it's really good and can't wait to finish it. She also says that you've spoken about, suffering from brain injury in the UK. In the UK, what they find is proving the presence of CO is very difficult, and wondered if proving carbon monoxide poisoning is easier in the US, and do your medics prove brain injury consistent with CO? And if so, how?
All right. So if I'm going to, let's take first, comparing the UK to the US, their alarm standard is much more sensitive than ours. And thus they're concerned about lower levels of poisoning than we are. We have somewhat of a 10% arbitrary cutoff in this country before people start to take a CO poisoning seriously. And my law firm doesn't completely restrict itself to cases where people had more than 10%. But in general, if you don't have 10%, then all the statistical evidence we have that we base medical diagnosis upon is much more difficult. In the UK, they're concerned about much lower levels of CO than we are, and that's a very, very good thing. I think, from what I understand, the group that has come to NCOA every year, they're focusing on really important things like low level CO in pregnant mothers, and no one in the United States is even thinking about it. Here, if the people who get transported, get their COHB levels measured, if they have above 10% measured, then someone along the line later may or may not take it seriously. But there are probably only 30 doctors in the United States who would consider long-term treatment necessities for someone who only has a 10% COHB level. And if it's below 10%, there's almost no one. Now, one of the things that I did want to talk about is the difference, what we mean by these. You hear two numbers tossed around a lot. One is the ambient air levels, and I've done this, and I've made this mistake for 15 minutes already without explaining for everyone so they understand. So there's two things to keep in your head. The first is CO as an ambient air level in indoor air. So the inside air may have carbon monoxide in it. And we usually talk about that in terms of parts per million. And 100 is something that can be quite toxic. 50 is not very far above what very, very bad standards are for what people are allowed to breathe all day long. So it shows you how desensitized our whole system was, if we think a 50 level is acceptable, because it's clearly not. And in the UK, they're way more worried about 50 than we are in the United States. But if someone has 100-part level of exposure in the air, then if they're taken to a hospital, they will do a blood test for what their percentage of carbon monoxide in the blood is. And I use a term called COHB, which stands for carboxyhemoglobin. And it may take you five days to learn how to say that word. It's almost easier to spell than say. Carboxyhemoglobin is the percentage of hemoglobin molecules in the blood that have carbon monoxide attached to them. 10% is a significant level. Very few people will live with levels above 50%. Occasionally you get a really fit athlete who can survive that and maybe a little bit higher than that, but people start to die at 50%. And of course, the people who are the most cardiac vulnerable are going to die before those people who are in excellent physical shape, because their heart requires more oxygen to function. So most of the death cases are actually as a result of cardiac failure. And if you get your carboxyhemoglobin levels too high, the heart will stop beating. And if not, someone's not there to revive you, you're going to die. So those are the two things: the ambient air level, 50 to 100 to 500 parts per million. In emergencies, we see percentage of carboxyhemoglobin, COHB, in the blood. Now, the reason generators are so dangerous is the levels can very quickly get to 1,000 parts per million, because the exhaust in a generator may be 87,000 parts per million. And that is just way too deadly. If it ever gets inside, you could, die almost, they say they drop where you stop. And
The Consumer Product Safety Commission says a single generator can put out as much carbon monoxide as a whole parking lot full of vehicles.
Yes, and I think that's a reasonable statement. The goal of the 2016-17 effort to improve generator safety was to reduce 99% of the emissions in a portable electric generator. In fact, it's probably more like 300 cars to what the equivalent would be of one small generator. And understand that lawnmowers have that same motor on them, and concrete saws have a similar motor. Chainsaws have a similar motor. These engines are very dirty. They're like a 1960s car. And if you don't have electronic fuel injection in it and a catalytic converter, it's very dangerous.
We have a question here from Dave. Let me see. I cannot see the question now. I think because we answered the question live, but his question is about mechanic and car auto garages, and how they relate to reoccurring exposure to CO.
Well, I take my car in to get serviced at the local Chevy garage, and I drive in, drive through, drive out. I don't see anybody falling over from carbon monoxide, and admittedly, it's a modern car with 1% of the emissions it might have had 40 or 50 years ago. But presumably they have very sophisticated air handling units that are constantly pumping in fresh air. But I do worry about it, and I'm always careful to turn my car off while I'm waiting. I don't know what monitoring devices they have for it. Everybody has parked in a parking garage, and usually you will hear those big fans come on. I'm always skeptical that that isn't safe enough, but there are standards for these kind of exposures, and the 10 minutes you may spend walking from your car to the elevator in a parking garage may not be serious enough to cause any significant exposure. but I do have several cases where someone used a generator in a parking garage and poisoned an entire apartment complex. Again, because the levels of CO in that exhaust are so much higher than in a modern automobile.
So that's interesting. So you were talking earlier about COHB and how COHB is used in the medical world as well as the legal world. Not always is it available to get your COHB readings immediately after the poisoning. Sometimes it'll take an hour or two or days before your COHB is looked at through the blood test. If that's the case, how do you calculate the half-life?
Well, the half-life of is the entire equation in terms of the acute diagnosis. All right. Let's just generally say that if I get poisoned inside and I go outside, it will take 4 hours for the amount of carbon monoxide that I had in my blood to be cut in half. All right, they call that a half-life. So if I have a 10% carboxyhemoglobin level, when I'm sitting in this room and I go outside for 4 hours, at the end of 4 hours, my level would be 5. Now it's almost never 4 hours from the time someone is emergently evacuated until they get their COHB level taken, but it is often 2 hours. All right. So you get removed from a premises. Let's say you have 20%. Okay. You get removed from the premises. You get your blood taken. They test for the COHB after 2 hours. If you had a 20%, we would now expect that you would have something more like 15. Except when you are removed emergently, you are getting something else, and it's called oxygen. And when they put oxygen on you, you are going to have your half-life drop much, much faster. So instead of 4 hours or 5 hours of time, what you're going to have is that half-life is going to drop almost 100% every hour. So a 20% person who has 2 hours of oxygen will now be expected to have a 5% level, not a 20% level. And this is never considered in the emergency room. And to do it, you have to answer several questions. You have to know exactly what time the person left the toxic environment, and you have to know how much oxygen they got. And then you have to do the math. You have to know when they left, you have to know at what time the blood was drawn, and you have to know how much oxygen they had. And presumptively, if you are taken from an environment that they know you have carbon monoxide poisoning, they're going to put an oxygen mask on you immediately. That is rarely considered. Sometimes the half-life will be considered, but they won't put the factor in the oxygen. Now, what makes it even more complicated and very, very significant is that if you have a family full of people who are evacuated, and they all get oxygen, the children's levels may be very nominal in 2 hours, because children metabolize on oxygen is in a shorter half-life is 20 minutes. So that means in 1 hour of oxygen, a child could have 3 half-lives, taking a level of 20% down to 2.5, which most people would think it'd be normal. So, so if you're sitting in a room with 5 people and they're all adult males, you can presume they're all going to have the same carboxyhemoglobin. And that gets interesting because if one person has a little different level than the other, they may say, well, this person got more poison. But if you look at the time they were evacuated and the time their blood was drawn, you can almost always explain that. I have a chart that let me show you, which is just one family and the levels and how they differentiated. Give me a minute to get that queued up.
Absolutely. I have a follow-up question on the oxygen, but while you're pulling that up, I'm gonna skip to questions that the audience is
I'm ready to show this right now, actually.
great.
Okay, so can everybody see that? Okay, so these are all members of one family who got poisoned at a wedding. All right. So as I arranged these by age. And if you start with the oldest person, it's not a surprise that she had the highest level, although her level is also explained. If you look, the three adults should have the same level. They breathe the same air. Um, they were in the same environment. And if they had their blood taken at the same time, they would have, they should have very similar levels. And their levels are very similar. 10 to 13 is pretty close, okay? But what's interesting is if you look at the difference between the aunt who had the higher level than the mother, two women should have very similar, two adult women should have very similar metabolism rates. Her blood is taken 30 minutes, 38 minutes before the mother is, okay? And the father's is a little bit lower, and maybe he got more fresh air. Maybe he wasn't as anxious by what was happening. And anxiety makes a big difference because it affects how much fast you breathe. Now, as you go down here, the young male, again, he might have very, very similar as the other adult male, but the teenage girl, the levels are lower. And then as you get to the younger children, it gets lower still. Now you say, well, why is the lowest level in the 4-year-old, not the 2-year-old? Well, that's because the time it was taken. And I've looked at similar numbers over probably 75 people, because we've represented a number of people in mass casualty poisonings. And you see this pattern over and over again. The children's levels are going to go down a lot faster. And any difference probably has to do with the time they were taken and how much oxygen they got. For example, you get a school poisoning and you have 200 people poisoned at a time. And if it's in a small town, there may only be 2 ambulances in the entire community. You've got 150 people poisoned in 2 ambulances, and there may only be 4 oxygen masks. So you're trying to administer oxygen. It's like, those undersea adventures where somebody's tank runs out and they're sharing oxygen mask. And it's really, really hard to really distinguish between one poisoning level and another. But the reality is you almost have to start with the highest level and presume everybody was higher than that because that level isn't taken at the scene. I'm saying, no. You had a question?
Interesting. So, oxygen really does, and time of uh, the delay in testing makes a huge difference in levels.
Absolutely.
So, what would you recommend that EMTs and ER, what can people do in those settings if CO poisoning is suspected?
Well, this is an idea that largely came out of the conferences. I think those breathalyzers should be the standard of care. I think all ambulances and EMTs should be starting to carry the breathalyzers like they're using in England. Because then you're going to get an accurate measurement right away. And if that's recorded, I have a family in Detroit where there were 4 people poisoned. Mom and granddad got hyperbaric oxygen because their levels, when taken, were in the 30%. The 2 teenage children didn't get hyperbaric oxygen because their levels were between 22 and 18%. And there's a strange arbitrary cutoff, and there's no logical reason why it's existed, that you give hyperbaric to those people above 25%. Well, everybody was above 25%. They were in the same house, breathing the same air. You can't not give the children hyperbaric oxygen and give it to the adults because the adults' levels are higher. And it's just wacky, but it just shows you that they don't understand the concept of how half-lives work.
So, breath testers, I got a lot of thumbs ups when you mentioned breath testers. So tell us more about these breath testers for those of us who are unfamiliar with them.
And unfortunately, I'm unfamiliar with them too, because I don't know any place in the United States that uses them. But everybody knows and understands the really pretty precise accuracy of the alcohol breathalyzer test. And the court system has accepted that completely. And my presumption, I don't know this to be true, my presumption is that the CO breathalyzers should be as accurate. And if every roadside policeman knows how to administer a breathalyzer, there shouldn't be any problem in training our firemen and EMTs to use them. And they may not be perfectly accurate. They might be off by 10%, but that's much, much better than getting a blood test that doesn't mean anything because nobody's doing the math on the half-life calculations.
Yeah, I understand that in the UK, every woman who goes for a pregnancy or a wellness visit during their pregnancy has to take a CO breath test at their doctor's visit because in the UK they recognize that CO poisoning is extremely dangerous for unborn children.
Yes, and unfortunately, the forensic science of how of connecting the dots of that fetal poisoning to ultimate outcomes is very, very hard to put together right now. And I applaud what they're doing in the UK because they're doing what you say. They're going to prevent it, and not
Catch it early.
try to figure out what the problem is after the fact.
Yeah. So, breath testers for firefighters, EMT, and even at the ER.
Um, by the time you get to the AR, there's no reason not to have it there, but you should take the blood test, of course, at that point.
What if a poisoning patient came in on their own or was driven there?
Well, that happens a lot. And the reason it happens is ignorance. The firemen will come out, they will determine that, yeah, the alarm went off, but we're getting fairly low levels. And so they don't feel like, or the people will be concerned about the cost of an ambulance ride. And a lot of times people who should be transported by ambulance don't. Or in a mass poisoning, people may go on their own versus waiting for an ambulance that might not get there for 2 hours. So it does happen, I don't know, a third of the time that people get there on their own, maybe half the time. And then, of course, it's often they sit in the waiting room for a long time. And again, each minute, tick, 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 the COHB level is going down, and that's a good thing, but it's a bad thing from a diagnostic standpoint. And it's so important that diagnosis be made on the day of the poisoning, because if you don't get it then, nobody's going to believe you could possibly have had anything wrong with you.
And then the symptoms that may develop, the long-term damage that may show itself after the fact won't be associated to the CO poisoning.
Exactly. And there are almost no specific symptoms for CO. Okay. Every symptom of CO acutely, if you were the only person in the room having those symptoms, could be considered to be the flu or some other respiratory illness. But the reality is when 4 people within a few minutes of each other get the same symptoms, that's when you have to realize that it's not you didn't all get the flu within 4 minutes of each other. Now, maybe you all ate some bad food and got poisoned from the food, but that again is not, that's not the likelihood. But every mass poisoning I've had, the first thing, no, they ignore the first person had faint. The second person had faint, people start, well, is there something wrong with the food? And then another 10, 15 minutes are going to go by before they say, hey, wait a minute, this has got to be CO.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, Julie Connolly is on the line. She is from the UK, and she says that the pregnancy CO test was initially done as part of the smoking cessation during pregnancy campaign.
Yeah,
Hello.
and it's great that they didn't just stop at that point. that when they got rid of the first mission was to stop smoking pregnancy, and that they continued when they realized that wasn't the only problem. That's just like I'm just so delighted with the work they're doing.
You
Thank you.
mentioned, people get suspicious when four people have similar symptoms at the same time. Chris Hauschutz is with us today, and it just reminds me of the tragic event with her parents in a hotel room, and the assumption that was made, tragically, again, that it was a double heart attack. Walk us through the logic of a double heart attack at a hotel.
Well, both people were older, but it was, I mean, the reality is that was just, and it was criminally stupid, and people got prosecuted for it. And the hotel, I mean, it was just a legal catastrophe that it took another death before anybody stopped to try to figure out what happened in that hotel room. And Chris and I have had this conversation many times. How is it that people can walk around a hotel and walk in a room that's got deadly levels, and I'm sure the levels were still very, very dangerous at the time they rescued them, and not anybody know that CO was there? We've got to have everybody who works in these environments to have some type of CO measuring device on their hip. It's just all, Chris has given me a list of all the people who could have figured out what was going on before there was a first fatality, more or less the second. But what we're talking about is a poisoning that happened in the Best Western in Boone, North Carolina, where Chris's parents both died in the same hotel room. And 6 weeks later, there was another family that was in that hotel room, and the little boy died, and the mother got severe brain damage. And in I guess in CO circles, it's called Boone. Everybody knows what you're talking about if you say Boone. And it did, for a little while, seem to make a difference in the hotel industry, but it didn't change very much. And I think, and there was an Airbnb or a Hyatt poisoning in Mexico, all kind of all close together. And for a minute, it seemed like things might change now, but it's still very, very slow. Those people are doing, like Chris, on the standards and the building codes to require CO detectors eventually should make some difference. But again, we've got to get better alarms too.
Thank you for that. We have a question about the CO breath testers. I'm going to just share a photo of what they look like. The premise, and if the doctors and nurses on the line would like to correct me, but that would be great. But the way that I believe that these work is when you hold your breath, the CO in your blood equalizes with the CO in your lungs, and you breathe out into the breath tester, and it recognizes the CO in your breath and gives you a digital readout.
Yeah, there was at least one exhibitor at our conference who had some handouts, and I thought I had them sitting around here somewhere, but I put them in a spot I can't find right now. But yes, I think, and I don't think they're very expensive. That was 270. Was that euros or pounds?
I don't recall, but I think they are right around 300.
I don't know how many ambulances. Maybe we can add, maybe one of the grants we should have the CPSC consider is giving a fire department like Milwaukee or maybe even a smaller city than that for a year and do a pilot project, because it doesn't seem like it would take a tremendous number of resources to improve this. But then, of course, once we've done that, then we have to, that's just the first challenge, is getting the proper COHB level. We still have to teach all the people up that medical chain the severity of and the potential for bad outcomes long term with levels that they might not consider to be serious. one of the things that I wish I could say I had a definite time, but I have had a couple discussions with people who can get work published in peer-reviewed literature in this area to work up carbon monoxide discharge instructions that uh, are just automatically given anytime there's a carbon monoxide diagnosis made at the emergency room. The one thing that the brain injury medical community did right when I started doing brain injury in 1996 is that if you had a significant blow to the head, now they wouldn't necessarily do it for all concussions, but if you had a significant blow to the head, you were going to get a head injury discharge instruction. And everybody probably has had some exposure to it because if I say they told you to wake them up every hour, that will trigger something. You saw it in a movie or you've known someone. For a very long time, probably 40 or 50 years, it has been the standard of care that all emergency rooms must discharge people with a suspicion of a head injury with those discharge instructions. There's nothing even remotely like that for carbon monoxide. And the simplicity of those instructions are important too. Now, they're trying to prevent a intracranial pressure event, meaning there's something in the brain that is bleeding and it's going to grow. And if you don't wake the person up, you won't realize that their neurological function is dropping very rapidly. And they are not sensitive to all the things that they really should be saying, but the concept is there. So if we could get the medical community to agree that there are certain things that need to be told to people when they leave, when they've had a diagnosis, or at least, if not poisoning, carbon monoxide exposure, we would be really moving it ahead. Really, it'd be a very big step, almost as big as the breathalyzers on the scene, because nobody knows what to do. And then if you put in the ER instructions, the discharge instructions that you gotta, here's the problems that you have, et cetera, the EMTs and the ER doctors who may not understand that are gonna figure it out just by reading their own instructions. And maybe the next time they treat somebody, they'll take it more seriously.
Mm. We have a comment that says we need CO sensors and alarms on smartphones.
You know, I'm not sure how far we are from that technology. I know that blood oxygen can be measured, and then Apple got into a fight with Matsumoto, whoever the co-oximeter people are, about the patent on that. And I think maybe the watches don't have the capacity to do it right now. So it's nothing that couldn't be figured out. I think the challenge is going to be that is a light sensitive tool versus your CO monitoring is essentially a sniffer. It's smelling something, catching particles in the air. So the technology may be more difficult than it seems. But maybe they can figure out how to put the CO part of the co-oximeter onto a watch. It's not impossible. And there are a lot of ways that smartphone technology could be used to do a better job of diagnosing symptoms like headache, et cetera. And the problem um, the FDA gets in the middle of a lot of these things, and you know, there's technologies that probably could be very helpful, but are they approved? And I don't know the answer to that. But the smartphone is a better, my iPhone is a better computer than I could put in this entire room 30 years ago, and I mean, I don't know if you remember your first Mac. And then when you really thought you had a great Mac in 1996, it doesn't have 1% of the capacity of my current phone. Not 1%. You know, I remember my first time I got a megabyte hard drive in a computer. That was probably about 1993. And now I have what, a terabyte on my phone? I mean, it's it's staggering what the capacities are. And more importantly, all the brilliant people who are working on developing apps for these devices.
Right, right. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, and a number of people are asking where can they purchase this book?
Unfortunately, nowhere. Um, and I have a much better draft of it under control, but I haven't figured out the logistics of how I would distribute it if I printed out another 500 copies. Um, but I think for those who do want to get an electronic version of the current draft, I can put in, I think in chat, the email address of one of my paralegals who can send a PDF of this. So if you want to read it on a e-reader or on your computer, I have that available for you. So just email Joy and she will send you the PDF of the book, which is, it's nice to have that tangible, hold it in your hand, but I haven't read an actual paperback book in a really long time because my eyes aren't good enough. It's much easier to read it.
Well, thank you for that, Gordon. Appreciate you allowing everyone to be able to get the book. Um, I'm just going to ask you a couple more questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
Cecilia asks, can you address chronic low-level CO exposure, which is probably affecting millions of people in their homes? It seems that the medical community is entirely ignorant of this.
Well, when you're talking about a medical diagnosis that doesn't have a clear onset date where you got treatment close in time to that acute onset, you're going to have to figure out the diagnostic matter from a different direction. All right. Now, we know what a certain percentage of carbon monoxide damaged brains look like on an MRI. There are about 30 to 40%, and I'm just picking a number at random, but somewhere in that magnitude of the people who have a significant carbon monoxide poisoning event and long-term symptoms are going to have abnormal MRIs and MRIs that are abnormal in specific ways. All right. So there's a classic sign of MRI, of carbon monoxide poisoning at MRI, which is damage to the basal ganglia. Now, the basal ganglia are deep inside the brain and very not likely to have been injured in anything other than an ischemic event, meaning lack of oxygen to that part of oxygen and blood flow to the brain. So when we see damage in areas that are not susceptible to damage on a traumatic brain injury, like a blow to the head or a concussion, that is a very clear diagnostic indicator that it could be carbon monoxide. But there is another, what we see in carbon monoxide poisoning, and to some degree, we probably could have seen it if we looked for it in concussion, but we see patterns of deficits across the classic neurological system. All right, so if you get pulled over for drunk driving, the cop is going to give you a roadside sobriety test. And many of the things that he's looking for in that test, can you touch your nose? How are your eyes tracking? Can you do a tandem walk? Those kind of things are supposed to be checked in every neurological exam and rarely are looked at very carefully. But we have the capacity to do a neurological exam amplified, or I call it the modern neurological exam, which isn't done in 5 minutes. It's done through 4 or 5 different evaluations. We see probably the highest percentage of clear deficits in people with brain injury, much higher than abnormal MRIs, when we test the ability of their brain to process information. And we do that through the ears, we do it through the eyes, we do it through the balance systems. So anyone who's having long-term symptoms from what they believe to be carbon monoxide poisoning and is having trouble with the diagnosis, an MRI may help. A neurooptometric visual exam. It's not going to the eye doctor at the mall. It has to be somebody who's a neurooptometrist, and there aren't 1,000 of them. So you have to look carefully. And there are even fewer of these, someone who would process, who knows how to test for processing of sound. One of the most significant overlapping symptoms of people with any type of brain injury, brain damage event is great difficulty in dealing with noisy environments and background noise. If you can't have a conversation, you can't hold a conversation at a cocktail party, and those people who know me from the event know that instead of sitting in the cocktail parties, I would go to a quiet place and have those conversations. If that is one of the most clear markers of brain injury. There are people who can test for that. Now, the dizziness and balance and nausea when you're moving your head, those are symptoms that are much easier to get diagnosed if you have the right person you're looking for. But every major hospital has an ear, nose, and throat department, and those people have very objective and scientific tests that, if they know what they're looking for, could identify it. So if you can't get your diagnosis because you have a specific event at a specific time and you get treatment around that time, then you have to approach it from the other side and look to what objective symptoms. Now, having said that, the biggest problem with almost all brain injury, and I'm becoming more and more convinced is true with carbon monoxide poisoning as well as headache. So, but everybody has headache. So what's different about this headache? The difference about this headache is when it started in terms of a time frame and the fact that it doesn't stop, that it keeps coming back, and that it probably doesn't fit the symptoms of classic migraine. And it probably doesn't fit the symptoms of the kind of headache you might get from a bad whiplash injury. It's a different kind of headache, and it's a bitch. I mean, it's a really bad headache.
Yeah.
And the irony, of course, is that one of the biggest cash cows in the medical field is treating migraines. It's just a huge industry to treat migraines. That's what most neurologists actually do. And they'll treat migraines without objective diagnosis, because there isn't any objective diagnosis for migraine, but it's really hard to get them to treat the same problems if it's from a vague carbon monoxide event.
Hmm. Well, appreciate that. And I know there are a number of CO poisoning survivors on this call, so thank you for speaking to them. Just a couple of minutes left, and I want to read a couple of comments. One, Reinhardt says, based on the same CO level, is a person at ground level affected differently than the one at higher elevation, such as perhaps a passenger on a plane or in Denver or Utah?
There's clearly a difference with we're talking about the difference between a poisoning and someone at altitude. Okay, so you go to a place like Breckenridge or 9,000 feet. Yes, you're going to have a much faster onset of symptoms. Whether the delayed symptoms and the chronic problems are worse, we're not sure, but that ischemia is going to happen faster because you start out with less oxygen in your blood. And that's part of the problem with the 10% COHB concept behind our alarm standard, is that that's 10% COHB in an adult male. Well, not everybody's an adult male at sea level, and very few people are at sea level. Now, I'm at 600 feet. I imagine you're probably something similar to that in Detroit. But most of my clients were at 4,000 or 5,000 or 9,000 feet when they got poisoned. And oddly enough, the greatest appreciation of the risk factor of carbon monoxide poisoning is in those mountain time zone states. And I'm not sure quite why, but maybe there's just a few good doctors started there, and they they had their disciples, and it's affected that entire region.
Really, yeah, it really has. Griff mentions that poses a question: do hotels have requirements for CO alarms in their guest rooms or common areas? Griff, I put a link to the NFPA report on requirements for carbon monoxide alarms as far as buildings are concerned in the chat. So you can have a peek there. It's 1 o'clock, and I just want to close up by asking you one last question. If there's one takeaway, what would it be? It seems as though proving the poisoning and understanding the long-term health effects to help these people through their medical and legal cases is sometimes quite difficult. So what would you recommend as far as preserving evidence for?
Well, the most important thing you can do for preserving evidence is if your alarm goes out, get out of the house. Don't open the windows and doors. Wait for the ambulance, insist on getting treated. And I don't know how many cases, probably 2/3 of the cases, when the fire department measures the levels, they're not at the peak level, because when people began to realize they might be poisoned, they opened the windows and doors, but they stayed inside. Get out. Don't open the windows and doors. Wait for emergency help outside. And I've heard some very interesting explanations of why people don't do that, including we're out in a mountain cabin, we're worried about mountain lions. Hard to argue with that one, but get out of the house, wait for the emergency people, and then go to the hospital and get tested.
Appreciate that. So with that, I'd like to just close out and say thank you very much for attending this webinar with Gordon Johnson. And thank you so much, Gordon, for taking the time to share your many years of knowledge and experience with us.
Well, thank you for the honor of doing this. I appreciate it.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks.